Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. James Paharic. Welcome to the fourth and final day of our Ethel Lefrak Holocaust Education Conference. I'm very excited about our program this morning, Genocide and Crisis in the Muslim World. We have two outstanding speakers with us, and I'm looking forward to a lively and informative program this morning. And just a quick reminder that we also have an event scheduled for 3 p.m. and it relates to an archive that our center has received called the Knights Collection. It's a collection of photographs and other memorabilia from World War II, and it relates to a veteran of the U.S. Army who discovered, he was part of the unit that discovered the massacre at Gardelegen, and that was involved in the liberation of a number of camps in Germany. So the session today will focus on our collection, our Knights collection, and be discussing how educators can access our collection for use in your own institutions. And then at 7 p.m. is our closing session with Father Walter Kajerski of the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, who will be discussing the papal encyclical Fratelli Tutti. So it's a perfect way to end our conference and to close out the day. So with that, let me introduce my esteemed colleague, Dr. Ronnie K. Odell of the Political Science program at Seton Hill University. She's also the director of the Global Studies program and in charge of Model UN here at Seton Hill. So Dr. Odell, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Paharic. I'm really happy to be here to help chair this panel and to help facilitate the discussion. As Dr. Paharic mentioned, we have two excellent speakers who will be presenting about their research, and they have a lot of wonderful things to say. As you saw, this panel is called Genocide and Crisis in the Muslim World. And so we'll be hearing from Dr. Bennett and Dr. Afridi. Each of the speakers will have 25 minutes to speak. And before each of the speakers, I'll introduce them with their bio. So in a minute, I'll introduce Dr. Bennett and I'll read her bio so that you have a good sense of who she is, and then she'll take it away. And then after she is finished, I'll introduce Dr. Afridi in the same manner. Now, during their presentations, at any time, you can ask questions. So you'll notice there's two places where you can enter in questions or even put your comments. One is called the chat, and that's where everyone who is in the room can actually see and interact. So you're welcome to engage in discussions and questions there. The other one is called questions. And so if you put your questions there, the moderators, I and the other panelists will see that, and we would be the only ones to see that. And so if you wish to put your question there, then I will make sure to ask it when we get to the question and answer time. But you can use both of those places to enter your questions and engage in discussion while the presenters are speaking. So without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Bennett. Dr. Bennett is an award-winning sociologist, widely published author, popular lecturer, and former broadcast journalist. An innovative and entrepreneurial leader, she is an active philanthropist focusing on conflict resolution and intergroup relations. In 2013, Bennett founded the Multi-Faith Alliance for Syrian Refugees, which has since worked to raise awareness and mobilize more than $170 million of humanitarian aid, benefiting more than 2.2 million Syrian war victims. In 1992, she founded the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding, the go-to organization for combating religious prejudice. She is also a co-founder of the Global Covenant of Religions, Global Covenant Partners, which focuses on delegitimizing the use of religion to justify violence and extremism. Bennett served in the U.S. State Department Religion and Foreign Policies Initiative's Working Group on Conflict Mitigation, tasked with developing recommendations for the U.S. Secretary of State on countering religion-based violence. She also served as chair of the Jewish Funders Network and serves on the boards of the International Rescue Committee. In addition, she is an advisory board member for the Milstein Center on Interreligious Dialogue at the Jewish Theological Seminary. In November 2019, Bennett was awarded the 2020 AARP Purpose Prize for her work with the MFA. And in July of this year, she was one of Forbes 50 over 50 Women of Impact. Dr. Bennett's recently published book is on the Syrian Crisis, Thou Shalt Not Stand Idly By. And she will be using that book as the foundation of her talk today. So we're very interested and excited to hear from you, Dr. Bennett. And at this time, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Ronnie K. I appreciate the gracious introduction. My colleague, Dr. Mehnaz Afridi, is going to be focusing on the genocide piece of this session. I'm going to be focusing on the crisis piece. So using the Syrian case, my focus today is going to be on the rescue of Muslims and the fears that stand in the way, while Dr. Afridi is going to be focusing on two live genocides of Muslims, the Uyghurs and the Rohingya. It may seem counterintuitive for a child of the Holocaust to take on the cause of Syrian war victims, because most of them likely want to see every Jew dead and Israel driven into the sea, because that's what they're taught from childhood on. But I embarked on a journey that proved even sworn enemies can come to see the humanity in each other. My journey began in Budapest in 1946. The apartment where I was born was missing walls because it had been hit in the bombings that demolished Budapest. During the siege of Budapest, 38,000 civilians died of starvation and bombings. My mother lost a pregnancy, lugging a sack of half-rotten potatoes in a desperate search for food. You may recall a ship called the St. Louis, which carried 937 Jews trying to escape Europe in 1939. They arrived in Cuba and were denied entry. They sailed to Canada and weren't allowed to disembark there either. They moved on to Miami and were turned away. Finally, they had no choice but to return to Europe, where after disembarking in Antwerp, more than 300 perished in the Holocaust, as did most of my family. So what does all this have to do with Syria? Well, when I saw Syrians trying to get to Greece in flimsy boats with borders closing to them everywhere, how could I not remember the St. Louis? When I was given gruesome photographs documenting the torture of Syrian civilians, how could their eviscerated corpses not put me in mind of my parents, grandparents, uncles, and aunts who were imprisoned or killed in Auschwitz, Mauthausen, and other camps? And when I saw the real-time destruction of Aleppo, I was transported back to the bombed-out city of my birth. And when I learned of starvation and siege being used as weapons of war, how could I not be reminded of my parents' wartime deprivation? As I watched millions of displaced Syrians pouring across borders, I recalled my own repeated displacement as a refugee child. As a Jew, I felt commanded to step up. How could I, as a Jew, not respond to the terrible suffering of Syrians, which so echoed that of my own family? And how could I, in good conscience, sit at my Seder table every year, reminding our family and friends once we were strangers too, without remembering my own experience of being a stranger in McCarthy's America? And how could I not feel compassion for the Syrians who were now strangers in many lands, including my own? If I was to be true to the post-Holocaust admonition, never again, then never again had to include my fellow human beings in Syria. And if I was to be true to Judaism, I had to make it my business to care for the stranger. I later learned there was a name for the vague stirrings that were driving me to inhabit a role I had yet to define, and that was humanitarian diplomacy. In my case, that meant building bridges between Syrians and Israelis, Muslims and Jews, through providing aid and advocating for victims. To that end, I founded the Multi-Faith Alliance for Syrian Refugees, which is made up of more than 100 organizations. And so far, I have to update the numbers that Ronnie K gave. We've provided more than $175 million in aid for more than 2.3 million Syrian refugees, and still counting. That story is told in great detail in my book, Thou Shalt Not Stand Idly By. But today I'm going to focus on only one part of that story, the case for resettling displaced Syrian war victims and the three great fears that stand in the way. The Syrian crisis has had a profound global impact. It's placed huge strains on host countries in the Middle East and Europe. The American response has shifted the balance of power in the Middle East toward Russia and Iran, while inadvertently altering relations among our allies, most notably the Kurds, who were our staunchest partners in eliminating ISIS's physical caliphate. But if we fail to implement humane and rational policies toward Syrian war victims, their crisis will become our crisis. That means we have to prepare for a time when conditions again allow for resettlement. But we must first separate fact from fiction about refugees in general and Syrians in particular. Pre-Trump, the US generally took in about half of UNHCR's worldwide call for refugee admissions. Even at that, only 1 in 500 are actually resettled, and 80% of those are resettled by developing countries that can least afford it. The US is bound by several treaties to provide asylum and resettle refugees. The 1951 Refugee Convention, the 1967 Protocol relating to the status of refugees, and the Refugee Act of 1980. The world has historically looked to the US as a model for humane refugee policies and has counted on us to carry our weight in resettling those who are permanently displaced. But the truth is that Americans have historically been leery of welcoming refugees. Pew surveys going back decades reveal that, with the exception of ethnic Albanians in 1999, the majority of Americans disapproved of admitting refugees. This includes Jews fleeing the Holocaust in the 1940s, Hungarians fleeing communism in 1956, Indo-Chinese fleeing Vietnam in 1979, and Cubans fleeing the Castro regime in 1980. Now, fast forward to the Syrian crisis. A 2015 Bloomberg poll showed that 53% of Americans rejected the resettlement of any Syrian refugees. Now, opinions can be changed with the right messaging. An international Tent Foundation survey, respondents overwhelmingly reported a sense of responsibility. They want to help, but they don't know how. But the more people know, the more positive they feel toward refugees. Knowledge of the conflict is crucial, as is the understanding that refugees are not displaced because they want to be. Nearly half of the respondents to the Tent survey were open to changing their opinions, especially after learning that most refugees hope to return home. Finally, people like to hear stories about the successful integration of refugees, and that requires policies that enable the 5 pillars of successful integration: housing, work, language training, education, and trauma treatment. To that end, the Canadian model of private sponsorship has worked very well. But for the past few years, US policy has been driven by hate speech, misinformation, disinformation, and 3 great fears: fear of negative economic impact, terrorism, and Muslims. So in order to arrive at rational policies, the myths behind these fears need to be understood and addressed. So first, fear of negative economic impact. Taking in Syrian refugees does not impede economic growth. Rather, it's a good investment. For one thing, with millions of jobs unfilled in the US, refugees contribute a much needed labor pool. Refugees arrive with few resources, but they quickly become self-sufficient. The International Rescue Committee reports that 85% of the refugees they resettle are employed within 180 days. Now, right now, there are about 90,000 Syrian immigrants in the US. Most of those fled famine in Syria and arrived in the period after 1965. They're highly educated and successful, and they're well positioned to provide a social and economic support network for their newly arrived compatriots. When they arrive in the US, refugees are immediately eligible for 3 months of public benefits, but the use of those benefits declines over time. By the time they've been in the US for 8 years, refugees on the whole pay more taxes than they receive in welfare benefits. Refugees have a higher rate of entrepreneurship than other immigrant groups and the US-born population, making them job creators rather than job takers. And the picture for Syrians is even more impressive, most of whom work in high-skill occupations. Yet the Center for Immigration Studies released a report, The High Cost of Resettling Middle Eastern Refugees, that ignored these data points. The report concluded that it costs taxpayers 12 times more to support each refugee in their first 5 years of resettlement than what the UN estimates the cost to care for them in Middle Eastern countries. Well, that leads to the simplistic conclusion that it's better for the US to pay for services in the Middle East. A Harvard Law School study gives a very compelling example of why it's economically good to bring refugees into the US. In Cleveland, for example, the government's $4.8 million investment in services for refugees catalyzed almost $50 million circulating through the local economy from refugee-owned businesses and household spending. But the CIS report I mentioned earlier argues that it's more humane to resettle refugees in Jordan and Lebanon. But these countries are straining under the burden of human misery that they're ill-prepared to handle. And should these countries collapse, the refugee crisis will multiply. The very countries that bear the greatest burden of the Syrian refugee crisis, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, counterintuitively actually buttress the argument that refugees don't negatively impact the economy, because despite their enormous refugee populations, their GPA is growing every year. And a report on a cash assistance program in Lebanon showed that for every $1 given to a Syrian refugee, $2.13 circulated in the local economy. The second great fear, the fear of importing terrorism. But the Syrian people are fleeing terrorists. They're not the ones committing the terror. The US has one of the most, if not the most, stringent and comprehensive 18 to 24-month vetting process. It's one of the most stringent in the world, and it works. No Syrian refugee resettled in the US has been associated with terrorist activity in any way. In fact, the threat from resettled Syrian refugees is essentially non-existent. Of the more than 750,000 refugees resettled in the US since 9/11, only 3 have been arrested for planning terrorist activities. None of them were Syrian. The Cato Institute reports that the annual chance of an American being killed in a terrorist attack initiated by a refugee is 1 in 3.64 billion. By contrast, the yearly odds of being murdered by someone other than a foreign-born terrorist, say one's American-born next-door neighbor, are nearly 253 times greater. Now, it's true, extremist groups take advantage of the dearth of aid and holes in security to recruit displaced persons. The despair and damaged dignity of refugees left in limbo leaves them vulnerable to radicalization. But Syrian refugees have not posed a major security threat to the neighboring host countries. In fact, a Harvard Law School report demonstrates that admitting more Syrian refugees serves U.S. national security interests. It increases our leverage in the Middle East, enhances cooperation from regional actors, and it underscores the importance of that cooperation in Turkey, Jordan, and Iraq, all of which host U.S. military bases. All three of those countries, along with Lebanon, are straining under the burden of Syrian refugees. So for the sake of stability, the U.S. and other wealthy countries must provide them with more support and relieve them of some of these dependents by resettling them. The third great fear is Islamophobia. It's at the root of our fear of imported terrorists embedded among resettled refugees. Specifically, we fear that Syrian refugees, most of whom are Muslim, will not assimilate. We hear far-right groups warning that the US and Europe will be overrun by Muslims, changing the nature of our laws and customs. Some argue that only Christians, Syrian Christians, should be admitted. But the fear of a Muslim tsunami is misplaced. Polls show that Muslim Americans are predominantly patriotic, share American values, and tend to be progressive rather than traditional. Muslim Americans are highly assimilated into American society, and according to the Cato Institute, Muslim Americans have more liberal views on social, religious, and political issues than Muslims elsewhere. Muslim immigrants in the US are less likely to support terrorism, violence against civilians, and aspects of strict Islamic law. In fact, 82% of American Muslims indicate that they're concerned and more likely to be very concerned than the general public in the US about extremism in the name of Islam around the world. Despite the hostility and discrimination they face in the US, 92% of American Muslims are proud to be American. They're more racially diverse than the population as a whole. They serve in the U.S. Armed Forces, where nearly 6,000 self-identify as Muslims, and that's probably an undercount. The three great fears are provoked by hate speech, an issue that was very well covered in an earlier presentation. We've heard leaders use words like infestation, cockroach, invasion, rapists to describe refugees and immigrants. There's an inexorable link between verbal violence and physical violence that starts with dehumanizing the other with words like that. American history is replete with linkages between moral fervor and physical violence. From the pious Puritans who burnt their witches, to the Ku Klux Klan who burnt their crosses, to the QAnon and MAGA mobs that laid siege to the Capitol on January 6th. Mobs that at their core wanted to purge the nation of the Antichrist, meaning Jews, Blacks, Muslims, and Democrats. Further feeding anti-refugee and anti-Muslim rhetoric are the conspiracy theories triggered by the COVID pandemic. An Oxford University survey revealed that nearly 20% of respondents agreed that either Jews or Muslims were responsible for spreading the virus, and nearly 20% agreed that Muslims are spreading the virus as an attack on Western values. The impact of dehumanization is increasingly evident in the United States. The FBI reports that in 2020, there were more than 8,000 single bias hate crime incidents that affected over 11,000 victims. Of these, nearly 62% were targeted based on race, ethnicity, or ancestry, and 12% because of religious bias, but that number is probably higher because ethnicity and race are often conflated with religions. And of course, Muslims remain the second largest target of hate crimes after Jews. But how can we meaningfully respond to hate speech to end anti-Semitism and Islamophobia? International and US laws don't prohibit hate speech. And the criminal justice system can only deal with the consequences of hate speech and react after it turns into a hate crime or mass atrocity. As of this writing, 33 countries have enacted hate crime legislation, plus the 47 countries of the Council of Europe. Most of what is ruled illegal in these countries would be considered protected speech under the First Amendment of the US Constitution. But incitement to violence is excluded from that protection. And although the US has no national hate speech statutes, 47 out of our 50 states have enacted hate crime legislation. The gaps in criminal law mean that religious leaders and other cultural influencers have a special responsibility for calling out hate speech when it happens and cutting it off at the source. Now, I've made this digression into hate speech because we need to get past our hateful stereotypes of Syrians and Muslims in order to implement rational and humane ways of caring for the stranger. It's been years since the US has met its refugee admissions targets. The agencies that keep the pipeline flowing have been starved of funds. The next few years must usher in increased refugee admissions, more aid in place, and the skillful exercise of humanitarian diplomacy. Refugee processing and resettlement is a complicated process, too complicated. What's needed is a holistic approach. Right now, federal agencies lack a uniform protocol for conducting background checks. They could streamline the process by developing standardized guidelines for all the separate agencies that are part of the interagency check. The process would also benefit from hiring more DHS staff with experience in the Middle East. And when travel to the regional sites where they do interviews isn't possible, then they can make use of video technology for refugee interviews. Once resettled, the focus needs to be on successful integration, and that's where public-private partnerships play a big role. Education is a serious issue for Syrian refugees, more serious than for most, because of years of displacement and attacks on schools. They need extensive remedial work to catch up. The U.S. State Department's small scholarship program needs to be expanded, and more institutions need to follow the examples of Johns Hopkins University and the Jesuit Refugee Services in providing scholarships for Syrian students. The philanthropic community can play a central role here by funding scholarships for Syrian refugees at their own alma maters and elsewhere. Now, during his administration, President Obama issued a call to action for private sector investment. In response, 51 major U.S. companies made significant commitments to aid refugees. Soros Fund Management alone pledged $500 million to help refugees start businesses. The corporate initiatives focused on 3 impact areas: education, employment, and enablement. Now, impact investing, which converts financial returns into social returns, can play a big role in integrating refugees. One, for example, Speak, a social tech startup, tackles the social exclusion of the displaced by taking on the barriers they face in a new city. They connect migrants and refugees with locals through language courses and cultural events that promote informal learning and common interests and build friendship networks. And their success stories include things like practical things like finding guarantor for a lease agreement, or helping to put together a CV, or helping to secure job offers. Legislative efforts to suppress resettlement over the past few years in Congress and in the states must be reversed, especially the repugnant tactic of some 30 governors seeking to withdraw entirely from the federal government refugee relocation programs. The governors don't have the authority to ban refugees from their states. The US government has sole authority over whether immigrants and refugees of any nationality enter this country. Elected officials are largely driven by public opinion, and public acceptance of refugees to a great extent is contingent on messaging. So we have to fund social media campaigns that provide facts to counter xenophobia and Islamophobia. With the new administration, the US has an opportunity to renew its leadership as a beacon for refugees. President Biden has reset annual refugee admissions at 125,000. But if there's one point that I need to hammer home, it's this. Displaced Syrians, of course, all refugees, must be rescued one way or the other. If we don't resettle them, we need to provide enough aid to give them some kind of life and some kind of hope. The antidote to radicalization is to do our share of resettlement and provide generous aid in place. In 2020, I became part of a council of religious leaders co-organized by UNHCR and Religions for Peace, where I serve as an honorary president. In our initial meeting, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees called on us to organize our efforts around 3 tasks related to refugees: acceptance, inclusion, and solutions. Acceptance means welcoming the stranger, changing the narrative about the displaced, influencing opinion, and countering the demonization of refugees for short-term political gain. Inclusion means prioritizing poverty and education and advocating for including refugees in the host country's existing institutions, schools, health systems, and so on, rather than isolating and segregating refugees. Solutions means preventing and solving forced displacement, addressing its root causes through dialogue and reconciliation work, addressing the causes of flight, and working toward a peaceful return home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bennett, for that wonderful introduction, not only to your own life and experience, but to some really great and wonderful information that is important for education and for understanding related to refugees. So I know that we will have questions for you. There's a couple in the chat and in the question box right now, and we'll come back to those after we hear our second speaker. But to the audience, if you do have further questions, please feel free to use the chat or the question box for that use. So now I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Afridi. Dr. Afridi is Professor of Religious Studies and Director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College. She teaches courses on Islam, the Holocaust, genocide, comparative religion, and feminism. Her recent book, Shoah Through Muslim Eyes, from Academic Studies Press in 2017, was nominated for the Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research and the Jacob Snitzer Book Award. She is currently working on a book, The Wounded Muslim, with Lexington Books, forthcoming, and a co-edited book on international approaches to the Holocaust with Nebraska University Press, also forthcoming. In 2019, she was awarded the Costello Award for Teaching Excellence in the School of Liberal Arts at Manhattan College. Dr. Afridi obtained her PhD from the University of South Africa, her MA and BA from Syracuse University. So now I'm delighted to turn it over to Dr. Afridi to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. And it's such a nice conference. I've been trying to listen to all the wonderful presentations, especially Jim Paharek, who has just been monumental in putting this together. And I love the way that you've put it together, Jim, so you should really be commended for this. And thank you to the Ethel Lefrak Center and, of course, Seton Hill and the National Catholic Center. But I just want to say, Georgette, how much I really, really resonated what you had to say, being Muslim myself and having to fight, even just my status. I'm an immigrant from the 1980s, especially recently. So I think we need to really think about what Dr. Bennett said, but also, I think it's connected to what I have to say and connected to the work that I'm doing. And as some of you know, primarily my work is, looking at Muslims and anti-Semitism, looking at rescue stories of Muslims during the Holocaust, and how I've placed myself in terms of looking at now Muslims in genocide. And a lot of real gratitude goes to my work in Holocaust studies, which has informed the way I think about genocide, but also look at the kind of differences that are going on right now as we experience genocide. So I'm going to share, case studies of both the Uyghurs and also the Rohingya, and then also talk a little bit about my book and kind of connect to, now that I've heard Dr. Bennett, so I can sort of connect to also what she's trying to say, so we can have sort of a full conversation at the end of this. So I guess my question is, and my new book that I'm working on is called The Wounded Muslim, Memory and Trauma. And so I asked the question, the wounded Muslims, many ask me what that means. Can Muslims be wounded? Can they be hurt? Some have said that I should be writing a book on Islam and extremism. But for me, as a scholar of Islam and genocide, I'm more interested in writing about other things. An obvious rancor of Islamic and religious extremism is the only rancor that we hear today. If Holocaust education offers us lessons of humanity and the catastrophe reminds us over and over again that these atrocities, human evil, and hate can exist at any time and at any period from Germany to China to Burma to Bosnia, the earth untouched by the blood of so many who have either been forgotten or, as I put it, not so important or relevant. I present today a few informative cases on Muslims and genocide and some ruminations on my forthcoming book, The Wounded Muslim. The first case, and I think one of the reasons I wanted to do kind of a factual storytelling about what's going on in Xinjiang and also the Rakhine state in Myanmar is because I think it's still not a story that most people know about or think about today in terms of genocide. The Chinese government has reportedly detained more than 1 million Muslims in re-education camps. And I'm just saying 1 million is what has been reported, but my interviews with Uyghurs, they say the estimates are about 2 to 3 million. So I don't have hard facts on this because of the government not releasing most of the numbers. Most of the people who have been arbitrarily detained are Uyghur, a predominantly Turkic-speaking ethnic group, primarily from China's northwestern region of Xinjiang. Human rights organizations, UN officials, and many foreign governments are urging China to stop the abuses, which the United States has described as genocide. So there has been certain movement in the UN. There has been some certain conversations about how to stop this. But unfortunately, as we know, the economic ties we have to China has paralyzed us. And I'll give you an example. I'm originally from Pakistan, born there. And our own Prime Minister Imran Khan has issued a statement that that China has done a lot for our country, and therefore we don't want to say much. But in the next breath, he will talk about Kashmir. So I just want to point out what happens while we are right now witnessing genocide in a country that we're involved with economically and our ties with that country. But Chinese officials maintain that what they call vocational training centers do not infringe on Uyghurs' human rights. They have refused to share information about the detention centers and prevented journalists and foreign investigators from examining them. And you can read a lot of reports from Amnesty International, how they've been detained, how they've been stopped. However, internal Chinese government documents leaked in the late 2019 have provided important details on how officials launched and maintained the detention camps. Some 800,000 to 2 million Uyghurs and other Muslims, including ethnic Kazakhs and Uzbeks, have been detained since April 2017, according to experts and government officials. Outside of the camps, the 11 million Uyghurs living in Xinjiang have continued to suffer from a decades-long crackdown by Chinese authorities. Most people in the camps have never been charged with crimes, have no legal avenues to challenge their detentions. The detainees seem to have been targeted for a variety of reasons. According to media reports, including traveling or contacting people from any of the 26 countries of China considered sensitive, such as Turkey and Afghanistan, attending services at mosques, having more than 3 children, sending texts containing Quranic verses. Often their only crime is being Muslim. Human rights groups say, adding that many Uyghurs have been labeled as extremists simply for practicing their religion. Hundreds of camps are located in Xinjiang, officially known as Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. The northwestern region has been claimed by China since the Chinese Communist Party took power in 1949. And this, of course, has some historical resonance of how they've been treated over time. Some Uyghurs living there refer to the region as East Turkestan and argue that it ought to be independent from China, and Xinjiang takes up 1/6 of China's landmass and borders 8 countries, including Pakistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. And what's interesting is that the people that have tried to get out of these camps have ended up in that part of the world. And I just want to resonate with Dr. Bennett's presentation about how developing countries will indeed take in more refugees, regardless of anywhere else. And we had the same crisis in Pakistan in terms of Afghanistan in the 1980s and also in the early 2000s, where we took in about 6 to 8 million Afghani refugees in Pakistan, which is itself facing a lot of crisis economically and in terms of poverty. Camp survivors describe the brutal conditions inside the detention centers. First, all new detainees are medically examined, abortions are performed on all pregnant women before they enter prisons. Some have stories, and I've talked to a couple whose 8-month-old babies are being forcibly aborted. Once inside the detention centers, both women and men are injected with the unknown substance or forced to take unknown pills, medication, which is believed to be forcibly sterilizing the Uyghur population. Now, we've heard this. I mean, those of us who have studied the Holocaust know about the sterilization effects. We know about euthanasia. We know about children being killed. And this is very much resonates with what went on during the Holocaust. Multiple female witnesses told the tribunal that women stopped menstruating after these drugs were administered. Again, we have, a very, very stark picture of women being victims. And so I go back to looking at the Bosnian genocide. I go back to looking at the Holocaust in terms of women and how they become sort of this template of sterilization by victimization, that they really need to have this transformation in order for them to disappear, meaning the Uyghurs. Cells are hugely overcrowded. Prisoners sleep on cement floors. One witness described being held with 40 women in a cell with no toilet. The smell was unbearable, she said. Food is scarce, and witnesses told the tribunal that some prisoners starve. Rape and torture are routine, witnesses also confirmed. Kelbinar Sildik, 51, is a Uyghur from Urumqi, worked as a Chinese language teacher in the city for 20 years before being sent into the detention camps as a teacher in 2017. And she says that, and she writes this in terms of her testimony, that people take girls into the investigation room where there's no camera, and 4 to 5 police officers rape one girl, one after another. After raping, they take electric rods and stick it into their vagina, and rectum to torture and rape again after. Afterwards, these women and girls would struggle to sit through hours long classes because their body hurt after beating and raping. Male survivors told the tribunal of black rooms inside detention camps filled with torture equipment such as steel chairs and electric prods. Some said prison guards had inserted electric wires into their penises. And the question is like, why am I reporting this? Why am I sharing this with you? And I'm sharing this because these are witnesses, some that I have interviewed, some that are not named. And if they are named, there are pseudonyms, because if they do come out and say anything, they are actually found, or worse is what they fear is that their families that are there are actually murdered. Case 2, the Rohingya. The Rohingya have faced decades of discrimination and repression under successive Myanmar governments, as probably most of you know. Effectively, they were denied citizenship in 1982. About 900,000 Rohingya are currently living in overcrowded camps in Bangladesh, again, developing, one of the poorest countries in the world, most of whom fled Myanmar since August 2017 to escape the military's crimes against humanity and possible genocide. The person I interviewed here actually was in Pakistan. I met them at a conference, which is strange, in Riverdale, New York. And then I asked to interview them, and now they're here in New York trying to resettle and trying to make a life. And this is the information I got from them. The estimated 600,000 Rohingya who remain in Rakhine State are subject to government persecution and violence, confined to camps and villages without freedom of movement. And we are cut off from the access to adequate food, healthcare, education, and livelihoods. And so this was, again, a testimony that a friend gave. And then, as some of you know, Wei Wei Nu, who actually works and does testimony work and works with the U.S. Holocaust Museum, I was really fortunate to also present with her at the National Cathedral at the unveiling of Elie Wiesel's stone with Alicia Wiesel. And so I was able to talk to her as well. Wei Wei Nu had never committed any crime, but at 18, she was told she was going to prison. She had just started law school when the sentence was handed down to her father, and by consequence to Wei Wei, her mother, sister, and brother. The family believed they would be released after a few months, but for 7 years, they were forced to endure squalid, overcrowded conditions in Myanmar's infamous Insan prison. Her brother was sent to another prison. According to the authorities, Wei Wei's crime was being the daughter of Kwa Min, a teacher, a political activist for the Rakhine State in Myanmar. For the last few decades, northern Rakhine State has been the epicenter of crisis. Wei Wei's family belongs to the marginalized Rohingya community, a community in Rakhine that continues to suffer persecution and mass displacement. So this is still going on since the mid-2019, and nearly 1 million Rohingya have fled to neighboring Bangladesh, and many, many homes have also been incinerated, bombed, or they kind of are trying to get rid of the evidence of how many Rohingya were actually in certain parts. In March this year, UN Human Rights High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet described a situation of, quote, systematic discrimination and pervasive restrictions on freedom of movement when delivering the office's report to the Human Rights Council. When the judge first gave us our sentence, she says, I didn't cry. This is Wei Wei. I didn't want to show my sadness or weakness. I also didn't want my parents to feel guilty about what happened to us. But when I arrived at the prison with my mom and my sister, we cried for 3 days. When we started the sentence, I had 2 more years of law school to go. Each day, at the time when school would have started, I felt like I was dying inside. No youth should go to prison without committing any crime. Their place is not prison. Their place is at the university. But Wei Wei finally earned her law degree, and when she left prison, graduating from Yangon East University, she looks back on her time in prison, describing it as her life in university, how it was one of the main triggers for her work as a human rights defender today. I realized, she says, how deep discrimination was towards women in all aspects of their life, access to education, to healthcare, to economy, to politics, and to decision process making. So I guess my question, and I'm not going to read all of this, is really about complicity and silence. And, while I've been working on Holocaust studies, as you know, I'm also an Islamic scholar. And, I really appreciate Dr. Bennett's sort of outward conversation about Syria, which is also part of my upcoming work, and how I talk about Syria being a genocide. But I also talk about Kashmir, and I talk about all these pockets of different parts of the Muslim world that are actually experiencing genocide or war. And that the idea that we see, for example, as Dr. Bennett said, fleeing terrorism, right? So, or that these Syrians are not welcome, or the Rohingya are not welcome, or the Uyghurs are not welcome, because actually they're Muslims, right? So they're actually fleeing their own governments, but they're also seen as Muslims. And so Islamophobia in Europe and also the United States plays a large role of why we don't really know about this and why we don't really advocate. Because somehow Muslims, in the mind of most people, are the ones that are the aggressor, the ones that are the terrorist, the ones that are extremist. And there's no way that we want to change that perception by actually accepting the fact that Islamic extremism itself is killing the majority of Muslims. That the problems of Islamic extremism have a historical alliance with a lot of factors geopolitically, but that we are really not able to see Muslims as victims. And this is something I want, that's why I call my book The Wounded Muslim, because people say, well, how is a Muslim wounded? What are you talking about? And I want to change the perception of how we see this. And what I just read to you about both, the Uyghur cases and also the Rohingya, it's happening in live time. This is not, I'm not telling a story. It's actually in the present. The people I've interviewed, their own families have been missing. The young man I've interviewed from the Uyghur community, he's lost 18 people in his family since he's been here. So what I want to say is, in general, the academic study of genocide has not at all specifically or considered Muslims who are persecuted, killed and murdered because of their religious identity. And this is starking. And it's just so obvious that this is because they're Muslims. Although the Bosnian genocide, right, was the most documented in this case, just 26 years ago. Even the Bosnian genocide, however, was coined as ethnic cleansing to distance any direct reference to Muslims. So my work, what it wants to do is looks at genocide in terms of Islam and religious terms. That includes, of course, non-Muslim analysis of genocide, but how did Judaism play a role in post-Holocaust? How did Christians believe in a loving God and world of suffering and evil? Can Muslims themselves learn about the work on theodicy, but also what it means to be victimized because of religion? And how can Muslims understand God and the problem of evil? And one of the quotes that I have is from Samantha Power, who was in Srebrenica, and she says, "When I returned to the United States, Sedbella and Srebrenica stayed with me. I was chilled by the promise of protection that had drawn a child out of a basement onto an exposed Sarajevan playground. I was haunted by the murder of Srebrenica's Muslim men and boys, my own failure to sound a proper early warning, and the outside world's refusal to intervene, even once the men's peril had become obvious." Thank you. And I'm just going to stop there because I think it would be better if we had a nice conversation together.
Thank you very much, Dr. Afridi. And now at this time, Dr. Bennett, if you also want to at least unmute your video, and I am delighted to be able to facilitate a conversation between us and hopefully between some of the audience members. So what I'd love to do is start out by asking a few questions of you that have come up in the chat and in the questions, and then that came up for me. And so I'll ask them all at once, and then I'll give you both a chance to respond. And then, of course, as we're talking, if there are other questions that you have as the audience, please do put those in the chat or the question box, and we'll get to those. We have about 20 minutes for this time, and so I think that we'll be able to have a really good conversation. One of the things that I really appreciated about both of these presentations is how connected they were with the actual events that are happening and the actual experiences that people are having today. So both in the Syrian situation that Dr. Bennett described, and then with the Rohingya people and the Uyghur people that Dr. Afridi described. And I think it's really crucial for us to not only think at a macro level about these kinds of events, but to really constantly remind ourselves that these are human beings who are being either tortured or killed or put through some in terrible injustices. And keeping that in mind, I think, is really crucial as we move forward in our discussions. And I really appreciate that both of you really brought that out in your presentations. One of the things that I'd love to ask Dr. Bennett, and Dr. Afridi, you might have a response to this as well, is the connection with religion. So Dr. Bennett, I noticed that you do a lot of work between faiths, so the work that you do to bring faiths together to try to address this. And I kind of had two questions for you. One was, do you find that there is even religious resistance or resistance among people of a particular religion to resettling refugees, and what might the challenge be there? And then the second related is, how do you use faith in particular ways to encourage people to be concerned about these crises, both genocide and both refugees? So I'd love to hear either of your thoughts on that. My second question was related to women's experience. So Dr. Afridi, I really appreciated how you pointed out that women are being affected in particular ways, and that they bear the brunt of the suffering in many regards. And so how can we not only think about the challenges faced by Muslims and refugees, but also the challenges between genders, right? And how women are particularly affected. So let's start with those two questions, and then I'll bring some others up in the chat after you respond, and we'll go from there. So Dr. Bennett, do you want to start with a response, and then we'll go to Dr. Afridi?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So, of course, religion has a lot to do with attitudes toward refugees. All of the world's great religions call for us to care for the stranger, to provide sanctuary. And certainly the Abrahamic religions are very important in terms of the value of human life. In Judaism, there are no fewer than 40 references in the Hebrew scriptures to caring for the stranger. There's only one reference to loving thy neighbor. And that's because it's very easy to love somebody who's like ourselves. It's much less easy to love the stranger. But coming off that theological 30,000-foot view to what happens on the ground, you asked whether there is something in religion that creates resistance to resettling refugees. And I will give you one example, which is from time to time. I mean, the Multi-Faith Alliance never encountered this, but HIAS, which is involved with resettling refugees, did encounter this from the Jewish community, which is, in terms of Syrian refugees, why do we need to import more anti-Semites? Because Syrians are taught from their earliest schooling that Jews are the devil because they support Israel, and Israel wants to kill all Syrians and drive them off their land. So there's something to that fear and to that resistance. But my response always is based on my experience with Syrians and Israelis forming partnerships and working together to alleviate terrible suffering in Syria, that once they encountered each other really encountered each other. They saw the humanity in each other. And all of that anti-Semitism dropped away. And I should say on the other side as well, the fear and suspicion of Syrians also dropped away when they saw their common humanity. In terms of women, 80% of Syrian refugees are women and children. And it is absolutely true that they are the most impacted by these crises. One of the main reasons for women fleeing Syria is rape, having been raped multiple times, and then being raped again when they finally get to what is supposed to be safety. And the humanitarian organizations, some of them have programs specifically designed for women because of that. Now, what Dr. Afridi was talking about, a colleague of mine and I are just finishing a book on religicide, which includes case studies of the Rohingya and the Uyghurs, among others. And Dr. Afridi is absolutely correct in what she says about what is going on, how the genocide is being committed very much through women and their reproductive capacity. And in fact, there are terrible instances in which in the Uyghur concentration, can't call it a concentration camp, it's a whole province that's a concentration camp. The woman who was charged with monitoring reproduction among the Uyghurs, because a woman became pregnant on her watch, she herself was sent to prison because of that. And the woman's husband was sent to prison for 11 years.
Thank you so much for that response, Dr. Bennett. Dr. Afridi.
Wow. I mean, I have a lot to say about religion. My background is in religious studies, and I've done a lot of work on, I remember people having issues when I took this position because they said, what does interfaith have to do with the Holocaust or genocide? It has everything to do with it. And, it's hard for people to swallow that. And the question was, well, what if, how would interfaith work help Jews? Well, it could have. It has. There were people who rescued Jews that saw beyond their community's discrimination, and also really understood what it meant to be, faithful, whether they were, Christian or whether they were Muslim or others. But I also want to say, I know Vicki Barnett is part of this conference, and she and I taught a week-long seminar on the interreligious approaches to the Holocaust. And it was just really a very interesting mix of people we had at the museum. And it was very interesting conversations that we had to think about, well, what does this mean, right? So I'm always about expanding the field of Holocaust because I feel that we're always thinking about, we're not reaching enough people. And a lot of our presenters said that. But the reason we're not reaching a lot of people is that we have to start to teach it differently for different populations. And why is that? Because as a teacher, foremost, and as a professor, you have to make that material relevant to the student. You have to make it relevant in the sense of, what if they're Catholic? Majority of my students are Catholic. I'm Muslim, and I'm teaching the Holocaust. So how does that in itself is an interfaith process, right? These are all three different religions, all involved with the Holocaust in a way. So that's one thing, that we have to see this work as broadening to people that are actually anti-Semitic, right? I did a lot of work on Muslims and anti-Semitism. And yes, I'm sure a lot of Syrians are anti-Semitic, Georgette. I will never, disagree with that. But I also don't want to paint a brush. I think there are people that will go out of their way to change who they are. And I think we have to allow that possibility and that fissure and that erasure in the way we think about a whole group of people. So,
which is exactly what I witnessed in
Right.
working with Syrians and Israelis together. So I completely agree with what you're saying.
Right. And the same thing with, Israelis in terms of, looking at issues of Palestine or the suffering of Palestinians. And the other thing I want to say is that I do a lot of work in this community of Riverdale, where it's a predominantly Jewish community with Catholic students and Muslim students. And I think those things really matter. And you might say, well, how does that stop genocide in Xinjiang? Or, how does it stop genocide in Myanmar? Well, it makes us think about the other in a different way, right? That the other is no longer a stranger. And where does it start? It starts with our future. So education, as Dr. Bennett said, is so vital to understand that Muslim Americans are successful, that Muslim-Jewish relations in this country are way more successful than anywhere else in the world, including Europe. These are facts that need to be said over and over again and be sort of fought against this rancor, like Dr. Bennett was saying, this horrible vitriolic speeches and hatred that we have heard for many years in the country. So I think there are many ways of doing work in terms of religious work with different groups. I think that women, I don't think I have to add to Dr. Bennett, but women in terms of war, not even just genocide, have always been, unfortunately, the most victimized, and also, seen as reproductive centers. So we're going back to this sort of idea of how can we stop this production of more Muslims? That's really the question, right? And that this is how we stop it, is by sterilizing these Muslim women and parents. And that to me is horrific.
I'd like to build on the point that Dr. Afridi just made. There certainly is fear of Muslim rates of reproduction, certainly in Europe. But there's mythology around that too, because reproduction among Muslims declines as they become integrated into the societies where they are. And there's a tremendous misperception of the number of Muslims in Europe, for example. And a lot of the fear is based on that misperception, this fear of being flooded with Muslims and overcome with Muslims. Only about 8% of the population in Europe is Muslim. And the issue there is that they tend to be so segregated in their communities. There is such rejection of them that they remain the other. And one of the wonderful things about Muslim immigration, both regular immigration channels and Muslim refugees in the US, is how well they become integrated.
Thank you both so much. I really appreciate your thoughts related to religion and also just the work that you're doing in bringing different religions together and thinking about how they approach these issues, which is so important. As you've both highlighted, it really does give us a particular perspective, the religion that we have. So I want to make sure to get to several questions that are in the chat. Dr. Bennett, when you were talking, there was a question from Michael C. about the Cleveland program. And so he was interested in hearing more about that. I'll just list these several questions and then I'll hand it over to Dr. Bennett and Dr. Afridi to respond as they like. And there were several people who were really inspired by the activist work that you both are doing and that you both discussed. Let's see, Michael Sand in the chat was wondering about anti-Semitism by Muslims, and I think you may have covered that, but you may both want to discuss more. Let's see, Sarah P. in the chat was noting how important this information is to hear. And let's see, Jean, see if I can find it, was asking about San Suu Kyi and the government involvement in the Rohingya genocide. So getting to the question of how governments are responsible. There was also a question about responsibility to protect, which is a kind of a theory that was created by the United Nations, passed in 2005, that said governments not only have the right to intervene when they see genocide happening in other countries, but that they have the responsibility to do so. So if either of you have any thoughts about that and how that might address some of the challenges that you both are pointing out. Let's see. One more that I wanted to highlight here, which was about large numbers of people coming across the US borders without appropriate documents and with limited availability of resettlement resources and funding. So how does society manage that kind of issue? So if you would like to both consider any of those questions that I raised and respond to them, and any others that you also saw in the chat, then that would be great. So let's start with Dr. Bennett, and then we'll go to Dr. Afridi.
So let me address the question about the responsibility to protect, because what we haven't gotten to in our presentations is how does one respond to these genocides and regicides that are going on. So the natural inclination would be to say, well, this needs to be handled through the UN. Now, the problem is that it's the Security Council that makes decisions about UN interventions. And when you have a perpetrator of a genocide or religicide sitting on the Security Council, meaning China, any one member of the Security Council can veto intervention. So it's not going to happen through the Security Council. Now, there are procedures in which it can be kicked over to the General Assembly in terms of deciding to intervene. And that's where the issue of responsibility to protect came up. But if I'm remembering correctly, that was never actually signed onto because states are very reluctant to give up any part of their sovereignty. All of this goes back to the Peace of Westphalia in the 15th century, which was meant to end the religious wars in Europe and to make the state sovereign rather than the church. So the whole issue of state sovereignty needs to be re-examined because it's one of the reasons that so much of human rights law ends up being so difficult to actually enforce. And in the end, so much of it ends up being toothless.
Thank you. And Dr. Afridi, and at one point, I did miss one question that, thank you, Sarah P., for submitting it again, which she asked about whether Afghanistan refugees are being better received. So let's go to Dr. Afridi and then Dr. Bennett, if you have anything to respond to that one as well.
Okay, I mean, I'm just going to say in general, because I know there's some questions about governments, is that, you know, in terms of Myanmar, there was a bill passed, I think 60C, I'm not sure, but I was working with the Rohingya and Burma Task Force, where we wanted to demilitarize the government against the Rohingya. That did pass, but the problem is it doesn't stop the violence, you know, person to person. It may stop the government from militarization, which I'm for, which I would sign, but it doesn't really stop them from escaping and not having jobs and not having food and all that. So I just wanted to say that, and in terms of, you know, looking at China, I mean, I agree with Dr. Bennett that, you know, we have someone sitting on the table making these decisions about human rights. And how can we move in terms of that? And then also, you know, the role of the UN, right? I mean, we've talked about this a lot. What does the UN mean? How active is the UN? What can the UN do? These are a lot of questions. I think what we can do, at least in my small, little, humble capacity, is to educate, right? Is to educate and to create certain formations or communities around this nation to start, thinking about how we think about Muslims or how we think about Syrians, and how we think about Jews. I mean, I do that a lot. So I think that's something we can do in our capacity, but also bring it to the ground, like a grassroots level, where it's not just sitting in academia. That's why I'm so involved with the community in terms of my own work. The second thing I just want to say about Afghanistan, which I think is fascinating, and please don't get me wrong when I say this, because I am a Muslim woman and I come from Pakistan, is, I love the Afghani people just as much as I love the Syrian people. And we call it the Ummah, that we are all one under God in terms of a community of Muslims. But I also feel the kind of need of saving Afghani women to be troublesome, because it seems like, that when it comes to saving Muslim women from a misunderstood level of Islam, everybody runs towards it. And it's a very, very fine line how we think about it. So in a way, so people are now looking at you like you are somebody who believes in the Taliban style of Islam, because it's back again, right? After 2003, after we went into Afghanistan, we are now looking at the same images of the woman behind the burqa, about lack of human rights in the Muslim world. And this has actually fueled the percentage of Islamophobia in this country. So we have to be careful about saving, right? And we have to be careful about helping and actually creating spaces, is what I'd like to call it, for people to walk into if they want to walk into them. But this idea of saving becomes very problematic in terms of how we see all Muslim women in the Muslim world, and how people are so concerned about Afghani women. Meanwhile, we've been having this issue in China and in Myanmar since 2017. So why are Uyghur women less important than Afghani women? And if so, why? And I really think we need to think about that really seriously, about what is at stake for us. And now I'm talking as an American about looking at Afghanistan as being a place to save all over again.
Thank you so much. And I noticed that we are over on time just by a few minutes. So audience, thank you so much for being with us a little bit longer. Dr. Bennett, do you have any just final words to say, particularly about that last question? And then we'll close up. So Dr. Bennett? Okay, I guess not. Well, thank you everyone for being with us. And
I'm
yes,
sorry,
I will just
muted.
He was muted.
Oh.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Just very quickly, with the exception of those Afghans who were allied with the U.S. forces, who were working as translators and so on, where there seems to be a lot of pressure to bring them in because we have a responsibility to them. Except for those, we are hearing the same kinds of hate speech, the same three great fears in terms of bringing in Afghan refugees in general. So I will just close by saying the beat goes on.
Thank you both so much for sharing these presentations and for answering the questions. It's been a really delightful panel. And thank you, audience, for being with us. So I know Dr. Puharich has some closing thoughts for us, but I also want to just thank you all for being here.
Yes, and let me just add my thanks. What an incredible session. And you've given us so much to think about and so many issues to continue to study through your works and related works as well. So it was amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks to the audience for being part of the program. And again, just a quick reminder that we'll reconvene at 3 p.m. With a look at our Nights collection and what it can tell us about the death marches that took place at the end of World War II. So please join us for that. Thank you all so much. Hope to see you at 3 p.m.
Thank you.